Welcome back to another book highlight. This one is actually a fairly short chapter, but it's a pretty intense topic, and it's actually one that I was not eager to write about initially. Even my editor said she was almost nervous to see what I would do, because how do you take a beloved, larger-than-life character and write something so horrible about him? Now, of course, we are talking at this point about David and Bathsheba because we have reached the point in the story where this happens. And honestly, if this were David's entire story, it would be easy to read him as a villain. And if I were making this story up, I would have left this out. I wouldn't have allowed a main character to fall so profoundly at this point in the series. However, it's in the Bible, so I had to address it. And I actually learned a lot from writing this in first person. And from what I'd explored of David's character already. I just did a lot of praying, and I had been thinking about it for many years, so I knew when it was time to write it. And it was very, short and powerful and, condensed. And I definitely didn't want to imagine out the sin. It was more about getting to the heart of what I wanted people to take away from it. So these valuable insights are what I want to share with you today because this topic has an important impact on us. Obviously, the main thing that stands out in the story of David and Bathsheba to us as Christians is, how did a man like King David fall in such a way? This should bother us, and yet it really disturbs me, some of the assumptions and attitudes and doctrines that come up in churches over this part of David's story. So just as a quick recap, David held back from going to war with some of his army, and he was walking on the roof of his house. He saw a woman bathing, and he summoned her, and regardless of the fact that she was the wife of his soldier Uriah, who was very faithful to him and loyal in the caves all those years, David sleeps with her, gets her pregnant, and then tries to cover up the pregnancy by having Uriah killed accidentally in battle so that he can marry Bathsheba. It's horrendous. And again, it's villainous, especially when you see the setup of Uriah's loyalty in my novels. I personally had never noticed this little nugget before, but I was chilled when I realized writing it that David was basically copying one of Saul's preferred earlier tactics with him. Saul didn't want to be the one to kill David openly, but he was putting him in danger in battle, hoping that would take him out. But David survived those sick, twisted games, and Uriah didn't. It just goes to show you how we can become the very thing we once hated when we allow sin to get a foothold. Now, I understand people being very dismayed by this story, but one thing I've heard from some Christians in this is this sort of defeatist attitude, like, see how big and bad sin is, how can we expect to stay upright if David couldn't? But this isn't biblical, and it's actually an insult to Christ's finished work. He has promised a way of escape in every temptation, and his victory has won for us the ability to resist the enemy successfully. So we shouldn't read this as a promise that evil has the upper hand in any way, unless, of course, we give it that kind of access, which we'll talk about later. The other disturbing idea I've heard coming up among Christians, and this is also the attitude some of David's peers adopt after Bathsheba, is that God forsook David and we basically should throw him out as a character. He's no longer worthy of being called a hero. His whole story is tainted by Bathsheba. We shouldn't take comfort or courage from David and Goliath or David and Jonathan. The whole story is ruined. But would you want God to do that to you? It's really a defense mechanism for people. They're so disgusted by the story and they want justice. They want a perfect hero to look to. We have that, Jesus. But would you want God to throw you away and all the promises he made to you and go back on his own character because you made a mistake? The main difference between Saul and David, even though Saul didn't do what David did here, rabbis today will tell you that the main thing that kept David in a good place before God was that he repented and humbled himself, whereas Saul refused to. David was grieved that he had offended God and hurt others. And you can read Psalm 51 and see how grieved David really was. That once his eyes were open to his sin, he accepted God's judgment, and there were consequences that did play out. But the big thing I realized from studying and writing this section is this. What we are meant to take away from this story is not paranoia or judgment or despair, but an understanding of how sin works. And writing it from David's perspective helped me to see the slow fade that happened in his heart. And even though I'm not taking on what David did exactly, I was able to see where I've had similar emotions and attitudes of compromise. And I could see an example of where that leads. We need to be able to find ourselves in these kind of stories rather than immediately slamming the door and assuming, oh, we would never be that bad. Well, maybe you wouldn't do that, but where have you fallen asleep or compromised? We're not meant to be paranoid as Christians, but alert and watchful, continually engaged in the work of the Lord, worshiping him and delighting in him, living out our relationship with him. And when we aren't, that's where our hearts get aimless and we end up in places we never imagined we'd be. I truly believe that since every other area of David's life was blessed and successful, this area, his sexuality, must not have been fully submitted to the Lord. Now, his pursuit of multiple wives was a cultural thing, and God was not totally on board with it. He had mentioned in the law of Moses that he didn't want kings of Israel to take multiple wives. But it seems like men of the culture just didn't bother to ask God's opinion, and they just did what was expedient for making alliances. But reading between the lines of scripture and knowing human nature and just exploring the cause and effect of David's life choices, I created in my novel some lingering tension in David's heart regarding the traumatic relationship he had with Saul's daughter, who was taken from him and basically used as a weapon against him. And this sort of, in my novel, developed as a thorn in David's side that he never truly healed from or submitted to God. And out of that unhealed wound, he developed this arrogance in his kingship where he started to believe, no one can stop me anymore. I have the right to take what I want and feel what I want. And this isn't an excuse, but as I developed this idea, I realized how easy it is for anyone to have a blind spot, an area of poverty of spirit where we get off track and slip into idleness and dissipation, which is like the endless pursuit of pleasure. Something in David was very broken and empty and never filled with the Lord, even though many other areas were filled. At some point, David didn't continue his pursuit of the Lord to the same extent. He got lazy in comfort, which is something that can happen to anyone. And actually, that really shows us that when God keeps his promises to you to get you somewhere big and important, or any promise he makes to you, whatever your kingship looks like, that's not the time to throw in the towel and say, okay, I'm king now, so that means that I can just relax all my standards. You need to stay vigilant. So what does all this say for us? There's an actual reason why David fell, and we can avoid it. We aren't meant to assume that this story means nothing for us just because we've never done that. We have to stay alert and be diligent in the Lord's work, even in times of rest. Keep pursuing the Lord, and when he reveals something that needs work, address it. Don't play with things that he says are unhelpful. Don't set foot on the slippery slope. Stay on the straight and narrow with God, because the troubles off the path aren't worth it by a long shot.